Hey there, and welcome to In Sickness and in Health, a podcast about chronic illness, disability, medical traumas, and everyday uncomfortable healthcare experiences. My name is Cara Gale. I'm not a doctor or a medical professional. I'm just a person and a patient who really wants to talk about this stuff more. Nothing said on this show should ever be considered medical advice. If you're experiencing a medical issue, please seek qualified medical help. I know the system sucks, but I do wish you a lot of luck. Every person is different, even within disease groups, so none of my guests should ever be regarded as official representatives or spokespersons for their conditions. Please respect their very personal choices, and unless they ask for it, please don't make suggestions about treatments or lifestyle changes. We talk about it all the time on this show. Unsolicited medical advice is never not annoying. This is going to be a short intro to this late episode because I did my taxes yesterday and it was really quite taxing. I just don't have the spoons to really make words happen right now. In this week's episode, I talked to Nikki about qualifying and listing for a double lung transplant due to her rare disease, LAM, which even I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the long name of because it is a real doozy. But of course, I've linked to more information about it in the show notes. Her longer origin story about living with LAM and her other rare disease, tuberous sclerosis, will be part of a future episode. This one is mostly about the transplant stuff and discussion about the healthcare system with Nikki's insider perspective. She actually used to work on the inside of health insurance and has a unique perspective on what the future holds for our healthcare system. You can check out Nikki's blog at ilivebreathe.com and find her on Twitter at Nikki Seesfelt. Find resources and more from us at insicknesspod.com and on social media at insicknesspod. If you can, take a few moments to subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes, which helps other people find the show. And I hope you enjoy this episode.
I really started thinking, maybe it is time for me to do more. They had a few internal openings, and I thought, what the hell, I'm going to go for it. And I actually ended up getting an internal promotion, which was great. And it was great to be, recognized. And I was in transition with that, and I was actually doing pretty well, starting to get more familiar with more of the inside, like how plans are run, what the renewal process for different employer insurance plans are, things like that. Like a really kind of technical, but interesting in and of themselves. And then I got sick. I started noticing in March, and I noticed like after I went to this conference to kind of catch up on the latest and greatest, I was short of breath. And I was like, well, I had been losing weight because I knew, sitting on a phone for 8 hours a day hadn't done me any favors. So I was, definitely trying to get more in shape and also using like a Fitbit just to be more mindful of what I was putting in my body and making better choices. And I dropped like 12 pounds that way before I had even, did the exercise component, just by being a little bit, more conscious, which was great for me. And usually that was enough to rebound my breathing. I tried not to get over a certain weight because I noticed that, my breathing would get worse if I was over. So I dropped all that, but it didn't get better this time. And so I was due for an appointment anyway, and I talked to my pulmonologist ahead of time, and I said, well, why don't we do a 6-minute walk? I think it's been a couple years. I don't think I've had one since I've been to New York here. But I said, I've noticed, the last few times I've exercised, I've wound up with a really bad headache afterwards. This is like 15, 20 minutes. It's not,
You're not running a marathon.
Yeah. So she said, well, I think that's a good idea. Well, I failed that 6-minute walk. I think I kind of freaked the tech out too, because normally to qualify at the end of 6 minutes, you have to be at 88. I started out at like 93, 94, I think. After 3 minutes, I went down to 81 and didn't rebound until even after 6. I was at like 84, 85. And I mean, the techs are so used to seeing all these people that are just kind of like borderline or having to, fight for coverage or whatever. I think she was kind of like astonished. And I mean, she kept asking me if I'm okay. Am I okay? And I'm like, oh, I'm just short of breath like all the time. And by that time, they had told me I was kind of like low end moderate to start as severe, which, you know, severe is kind of like your 40% threshold. I was still above that, but I mean, I was definitely having daily, you know, shortness of breath, like, especially if you know, talk to me for a while. Wouldn't be immediately obvious, but you could tell after a while. Or if I was lifting heavy things, stuff like that, you know. So it definitely needed oxygen. And I was like, well, this is just for exercise. It's probably no big deal. And yes, I'll have to kind of monitor and make sure I'm not going too low with other things. But I didn't really think that much of it. But I said, well, let me go down to the University of Pennsylvania and check in with my team, because my pulmonologist that I had up until like this last, a little bit over like a year, I think he's been gone now. He moved to Florida, kind of 2010 or 2011, sometime in there. He says, I just want you to go down there. I want you to check in with them. I want you to just talk and get the facts about transplant. He says, I know you're way too healthy to be tested, but he says, I've seen too many people with, you know, cystic fibrosis and other diseases, especially young people, be too afraid to have these conversations when they need to have them, and be intimidated by the process. And he said that, you know, I would just feel more comfortable. At least you're getting some basic information. I don't think it'll hurt. And at first I was kind of like, well, I don't even feel sick, so it's probably pointless. But on the same token, given the fact that I am under 50%, there is a possibility that transplant might be in the cards at some point. So sure, okay, I don't see the harm in going down there. And I met with the doctor, who's my pulmonologist to this day, and, you know, I love him. It was very grim and a very hard conversation, of course, and he told me I was way too healthy, which at the time, you know, I was glad for, especially after I got the statistics. But, you know, in a couple years after I failed that walk, then I was like, man, I need to go down there and I need to check in, because they need to know that I'm on oxygen now. And I kept thinking, it's just stupid oxygen, like, big deal. Not going to amount to anything. Probably still too healthy to be tested, but they need to see me. So I went down there, and this was a couple of days before my birthday last year. And he told me, he said, well, your numbers definitely qualify you for an evaluation. And since, you know, you have started oxygen, I think it would be a good idea for you to at least start getting tested. And I thought, I'm still not feeling sick, but okay. I'd seen enough women with LAM over time, both best and worst cases, as far as transplants go, that I had a more balanced view. If you would have asked me back in, say, 2009, if I would have needed something then, I wouldn't have done it. Yeah. And here's why. There were many women who I knew that went in for the transplant, but then never made it out of the hospital. Of the few that I did know that made it out, one of them died of leukemia a year or two after their transplant. I was devastated by that, because I had met this woman at a conference, and she was just beautiful, and she was just telling me how transplanting changed her life, like how things were so much better and easier, and how she was, you know, really had a second lease on life after, you know, what she had been through at the hands of this disease. And so I felt that that was wholly unfair. There was another woman who I know just around the time that I was diagnosed, who I never met in person, but had kind of corresponded with, who was around my age at the time. I was 26 when I was diagnosed. She had a living lobar transplant. I think she had family members that did it. She got a blood clot the day after surgery, and she died. And I just thought, why do people go through this? And it's, you know, they don't even make it out.
Yeah.
Like, this is just, you know, I can't imagine. Well, in 2009, then I started meeting some other women who were my age and younger, but who actually had successful transplants. And probably the biggest example now, she's like 10 years out, was Justine Lamond, and she lives in like the UK, and she is an absolute freaking hero, because she's done things that most people would never dream of doing. Like, she sailed the world
Wow.
like a year or two after her transplant in a competitive sailing race.
That's amazing.
And then she's like climbed like Everest, I think, or
Holy shit.
something like that. She made it up like 800 feet or some shit like that. Like she
That's
couldn't make it
wild.
all the way to the top, but I mean, damn.
Yeah.
You know, and then she dances burlesque. She talks a lot about organ donation and stuff like that. And this is a girl who, like, literally was inches from death when she got the call over in the UK. I mean, she had like, I don't know, God, probably at least double the amount of lung collapses I had had over the course of my diagnosis, and was on like a ventilator before she had her transplant. And look at her now. Like, she is just amazing, and she's amazingly supportive for every woman she meets with LAM and for every woman that she meets with, a double lungy. So I mean, I saw that, but then I started meeting other women who were in the States, a couple of them in Iowa, other people that I've met in Lamposium a few years back, that LAM conference, who to this day are still my mentors and still help me through this process a lot, who, did have successful outcomes, who are married, have families, so it was very rough for them, even at that age to be, that sick that quickly and everything. It's not a cure, but they definitely have a much better life than what they had. And I mean, they're living outside of that average 5 years or whatever that they give. So, that gave me a more balanced perspective. And so, I have realistic expectations. And then I met a few people over the course of my stay, because there's a couple of transplant houses in Philadelphia, luckily. So when I go there, I don't have to go back the same day if I don't feel up to it or don't want to. And so my friend and I stayed down at the Gift of Life house for when I was evaluated, and I met a few other people who've helped me a lot and have actually had, some problems, but then also wound up really well. And then I've met a few more people in my area just from the different articles and stuff that have kind of run on me. And, those people have reached out to me and shared their stories. And so there's a lot more hope. But there's also, I'm fortunate that I've been kind of one to kind of watch and learn from everybody else as I go. So I don't have any, false expectations about like what this is going to do. It's not going to cure me, but definitely it's going to be easier than living with, less than 30% of my lungs.
Yeah.
Wow. And so I decided, I told them, I said, I would rather wait till like August, because I said, I have my summer mapped out. I haven't been home in a while, and I know I'm not going to get much time, but I plan to go home over the 4th of July weekend. I said, I would like to at least, do this and do that and get a little bit of R&R time in before I have all these tests. And he didn't seem to think that that was a problem when I talked to my transplant doctor. But I told him, I said, look, I'm not, going to put it off indefinitely. He says, no, but those are good reasons, for putting it off a little. He's always been the type that's just very supportive and always trying to recognize, too, that his patients have a life outside of what they're dealing with and trying to encourage them to live that. So I was doing okay, and I was kind of hemming and hawing because I knew I would have to set aside time for the evaluation, and I didn't know what to say to anyone at work about it. If I should tell them that I just needed the time, if I should say anything, whatever. I talked to my outgoing manager about it, and I just said, I just feel like I want to tell someone, just in the event, something happens or I get sick, and I have to be out, people realize that it's something serious. And, I played off the oxygen a little bit, and I told him, I said, it is, but I was honest about it. I said, it is getting on towards summertime. And I said, the humidity I notice always affects me. So I said, if I come in wearing this, I don't want anyone freaking out. It's no big deal. My doctor just said it's time for me to have this. And they were all like pretty cool about it. And they know, I'm a hard worker. I kind of put my nose to the grind, and I don't complain a lot or say much of anything. And I don't do a lot of chit chatting or whatever. So they were okay, which was kind of reassuring to me, because I never know how people at work are going to react to a change like that. I don't obsess over it, but I mean, obviously it goes through your head kind of like, are they going to treat you any different with this? Well, I was, the 4th of July came and went, and I I went back because it was my 20th high school reunion by then. And there was quite a few of my classmates back, which was cool. And then my family usually has a nice big family reunion out at one of the lakes on the 4th of July. And so I had my portable concentrator by that time, and I definitely needed it for flying, and I needed it for walking around and everything. I didn't really need it the day of the reunion, which was good. I kept it with me just in case. And I got to see a lot of people I hadn't seen in years, and so that was really cool. But then I had to, tell my cousin about what was going on, and I knew that was a little bit hard for him, I think, because he had known kind of bits and pieces here and there, but he'd always kind of seen me come through the worst of it. It was hard for me to tell my family because I have a lot of cousins who are around my same age, on like my dad's side that I grew up with. So they're like brothers and sisters to me, and they have children who are younger. I was just like, I have to tell them what's going on, but hopefully I won't freak out, their kids too much, but at least maybe I should tell them. So just in case they see me out at the lake or whatever, they're not gonna, their kids aren't going to be scared by it. And they might have a chance to talk to them or mention it. No big deal. Because it was definitely a change, even the ones that are like school age, from when they saw me. And I ended up that day needing it for about half a day because I wasn't staying up. And so that was a little hard. But, my family's always been very supportive, and my cousins have been very supportive of me. And I'm lucky in that regard that I have the friends that I have, but then I also have the family that I have. I've never been, like some people, blamed or told to buck up or any of this other kind of like nonsense that sometimes families put on people who are chronically ill.
Yeah. Oh, I know.
So I'm very fortunate in that regard. So, I went back, and then a couple of weeks went by, and I'm at work, and all of a sudden, I start to feel short of breath. And I thought, well, it is mid-July. Maybe it's just the humidity. So I put on the concentrator, put it on 2, and I'm not going up. And I check in another 15 minutes, and still not going up. So I bump it up to 3. And by this time, I checked again in another 10 minutes or something. And I was down in like 79 or something like that. And then I freaked out because I'm like, that is way too low. And this thing only goes up to 4. Like, I'm going to bump it up to 4, but what if it's not enough to get me to rebound? And so I pulled my supervisor aside and I said, look, I don't want to freak anyone out, but I said, my oxygen levels are really screwy. I do need to go and leave and get this checked, but I don't know where to go around here. Because I worked like an hour and a half from my house at the time. So I was, kind of far away. I said, do you know around here, where I can go? And I said, would you mind driving me? Because when I'm this low, I get really scared. I don't want to, pass out on a highway or something out there. I don't think it's safe for me to drive. And she says, definitely not. And she's like, do you want to call an ambulance? And my first thought is, this fucking embarrassing. But then I said, well, how far is it? And she says, well, it's probably a half an hour, 45 minutes. And I said, well, I don't really want to, but yeah, maybe we should call an ambulance, because we had actually headed out the door as we were deciding. I said, because what if I need more oxygen? At least I can get more oxygen in the ambulance. I said, I don't want to pass out in your back seat or anything or freak you out either. Plus, I said, it's probably get in faster if they take me in the ambulance anyway. So they had to take me there, and they took me to like Doylestown, which is like halfway between Philadelphia and halfway home, because they couldn't take me either place. It was too far. So I wind up in this strange ER, with all of this stuff. And I said, I don't know what's going on, but I just can't seem to get my oxygen levels straightened out. And then, they had finally gotten me stabilized. I said, well, I do have a history of lung collapses. And I said, well, the x-ray doesn't show that. And I said, well, sometimes these small collapses don't show up on an x-ray. I said, in fact, I had my pulmonologist, the last appointment I was at in May, found an unresolved, like really tiny area where my pleurodesis had pulled away, and I had a really small lung collapse there. I said that it was only when he rotated the view on the CT that anyone could even pick it up. I said, so I want another CT just to rule it out completely. He says, well, the radiation, blah, blah, blah. I said, I understand you're doing your job. I said, but I would take my chances with the excess radiation for my peace of mind. I am not leaving here until I know for certain that I do not have a lung collapse, or there's not something that I need to, that I'm going to have to wind up at my home ER in like 6 hours because it got missed here. I'm sorry. So, they didn't find anything, and they sent me home. And they refused to call Penn for whatever reason. So I ended up just calling, and they said, well, sometimes this happens. And the one nurse practitioner was kind of giving me hell. He's like, you're in end-stage lung disease. You really shouldn't be driving. And I was just like, at that point, I was just like, you know what? But nobody ever told me that I couldn't.
Yeah.
So by this time, like, now, of course, now I know that I shouldn't be driving long distances, but I was never told this before. So, I'm not going to stop my life if I'm feeling okay. And then he kind of backed off a minute, and he says, yeah, you're right, I understand. And so he says, it looks like everything's fine. If they're saying the CT is clear, go home. And if you have another problem, I guess you go back. They find what they find or whatever, or give us a call. So that was frustrating because I was at least used to this other stuff for it to be a problem and you just go in and fix it, right? It was really concerning for me to like have this breathing issue and not know like what the hell caused it. But my friends were really good. They came up, they got my car, swung around, got me, went home. And then, they basically told me, don't go back to work until after the evaluation. And I was just like, yeah, I kind of figured you were going to say that. So then I just decided, because I kind of figured in my mind that this was going to lead down some path. I just had foresight. I decided to go ahead and start the process to file Social Security disability just because I knew there was a waiting period for that or whatever. And so I did that. And then I had my evaluation in August. And then they told me, you're definitely going to need new lungs. And I was actually going to list much sooner than what I just listed, except in October. I was on my way over to exercise at my community center, and some jerk comes down the hill at an insanely high rate of speed. I see his tires cross the yellow line. I pull over. I'm completely pulled off the road, and he still hits me head on my driver's side.
Oh, God.
And I took all of that impact to my chest.
Oh.
All. And I thought, oh, this asshole, is he going to screw everything up for me? Like, it's not enough that I had all of this shit happen since May. And I can't, now I can't work. Now I can't, I have to think about transplant. This is not something I need right now.
Yeah.
I got really paranoid because I had left my cell phone on my bed. And as I was trying to reach to call, first reaction ambulance, but then call my friends to say that I was okay, boom. No phone. Mm-mm. And I was hurt too badly for them to take me to the local hospital I normally go to for treatment. I had to go to the same hospital system, but a different campus over in Bethlehem. I wound up with a broken rib. Luckily, it was at the top, like near my neck, and not near my lungs, which I was deathly afraid of as I took all that impact. I'm like, hey, better not collapse a lung because I don't know how the hell they're going to fix it if I break a rib in the wrong place. Plus, I had inhaled all the airbag dust, and because of my reduced lung function, I couldn't cough it out.
Oh, yeah.
And so that gave me aspiration pneumonia. So I spent 4 days in the trauma campus for them to kick me out too early, and then to have to go back that same night, that at least I could go back to the normal ER. Spent a week there in that hospital, and then by that time I, of course, was so weak that I needed pulmonary rehab. At least my insurance approved that, but it was different than in New York where they have like the kind of inpatient rehab wings of the hospitals. Here they have them like attached to the nursing home and stuff. And so I had to spend like a week and a half, 5 full days, and then parts of weekends in a nursing home getting pulmonary rehab. Mm. And luckily I healed up pretty well. But that's when I realized how sick I was, because I was like,
yeah.
this rehab is like worse than any rehab for my lung collapses, and I am no wuss. I just was like, I know there's, it hit my brain. There's like no way possible, even if there was another drug or whatever, there's just nothing that's going to turn this around. I have to have this transplant. And so that, was a period of adjustment too, for the full reality to kind of sink in. But I recovered, and then we're nearing the holidays. So they decided it would be in my best interest to wait till after the holidays and get a little time in between hospitalizations. So I was supposed to list probably in like January or February, and then we had a snowstorm hit in January where we got 36 inches of snow. We still weren't dug out, so I had rescheduled, and that pushed me back a month. So now finally, as of March 1st, I'm listed. And that's the, full gamut of all the freaking health junk at the hands of my two rare diseases. I mean, tuberous sclerosis affects maybe 1 in 6,000 people. And then I think the actual U.S. count of women with LAM, even if they don't have tuberous sclerosis with it, because sometimes it just happens that women get it, what they call sporadic cases, is like, I think at most maybe 250,000. If and that might even be the worldwide instance. So I mean, very, very rare diseases, but luckily I'm in places where there's good treatments with people who see a fair majority of it, and so that has helped me, because I don't think I would be where I am without those resources.
Yeah, for sure. Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not even 40 yet. I'll be like 39 in May. So, this is sometimes hitting me at an age where it's, I know younger transplant patients too, but I mean, still, this is not, at least I'm not having to worry about age criteria either. Like I know, some other transplant patients, if they have, like, say, pulmonary fibrosis or scleroderma or some of these other diseases, like they do tend to be a little bit older. And then they have to kind of wonder if they're too old to get transplanted or nearing that age. At least that's, to my advantage too, that I'm a little bit younger, which might also help me be a little bit more resilient and recover a little quicker.
Right. Once you get the transplant, you'll be on like anti-rejection medication and stuff like that forever.
They sent me like a list, and I'm on like 8 to 10 drugs now, because I also have asthma in addition to my LAM. Like when they do my lung function testing, like after they give me a shot of albuterol, like I do like 30% better or something like that. Yeah. So, I often wonder as a kid and stuff, when I was in junior high and stuff, I would get really winded if I would try to run or do track and stuff. And I always chalked it up to being a little bit pudgy at that age, but I kind of wondered if maybe I had a little bit of exercise-induced asthma that wasn't up on, because I never really complained about it. So yeah, I'll trade some of the drugs that I'm on now for others, but I'll probably, at least for the first year, I'll be on 20, probably, different meds. Anti-rejection, antiviral, antifungal, I think, just because you're so susceptible in that first year to even just acute rejection, like because of the newness of the surgery and getting time to adjust to the donor lungs and everything, they hit you with a lot more medications within the first year, and then they try to pull you off some of them and see how you do. If you do really well, then you're still probably going to have at least probably 8 to 10 that you're on for life, even in the best case scenario. So yeah, the drugs are a big part of it. And of course that is, primarily to ward off a rejection, but it's also sometimes too, if you have antibodies in your body that make you susceptible to certain viruses and stuff, that's why they treat you with some antivirals and stuff to start with. Yeah.
Because I keep seeing these headlines about how they're getting ready to start doing, or at least start testing transplants between HIV patients and hepatitis patients. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you should say that too, because they also consider those types of donors and a few others like high risk. They are considering other donors now that they didn't used to. But I mean, the high risk donors now, like men who have had sex with men within the last 5 years, and it's not because of a homosexual lifestyle. It's because there's certain illnesses that they might be privy to, sexually transmitted or otherwise, that you as a recipient wouldn't normally be exposed to. Same with, prisoners. Like, that could mean any number of things. Somebody in prison for drugs, or it could be, somebody writing a bad check.
Right.
But there's institutional bugs and different things that you could be exposed to in a prison environment that you wouldn't be exposed to otherwise. So they consider that high risk. Drug use. And you can have somebody who is a drug addict but still gets tested regularly and takes, is a functional addict and takes decent care of themselves. You do hear about this a lot more with like the heroin epidemics and some of the other things. So those organs don't go to waste, but there's always the chance, because especially if they use IV drugs, there's higher risks for, those types of infections that you normally wouldn't be exposed to. So all of this, I actually have a meeting next week I have to go down for, but they explain all the different high-risk organs and have you sign consents. And it's pretty interesting. If you get calls for those because you agree to be called, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to accept that organ. If you're uncomfortable with the backstory they give you behind it, you won't lose your place on the list. You don't have to accept if you're not comfortable, but they will tell you, simply because you will be, you could be at risk for hepatitis or different things. And they test for them, but, still.
Right.
There's absolutely no, guarantee. The risk is negligible, and it definitely beats, waiting additional months for an organ and getting progressively worse. So it's always a risk-benefit thing, but that's what they leave to you as a decision. Are you comfortable with that? If not, that's fine, but then you're not going to lose your place. But then that means, it might be another couple months before you get another call. So, that is something that a lot of people don't realize either, and I didn't realize until I got pretty deep in the process, just the, different classifications of donors and just how many things that they actually test for and test you for, as far as blood work and stuff and antibodies and everything. They try to give you the best shot out of the gate with this to head off any potential problems as they can, and long as they not only try to match you as far as blood type, they try to match you relative size, relative age, if they can, different things. So, they're giving you the most compatible that hopefully you can get to give you, a better shot.
Yeah, because it's a pretty uphill battle already.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
And it's funny, smokers are not considered high risk. So
What? Makes no sense.
Yeah, so you can have someone who smokes, even socially, or even up to a certain percentage, and, they can still donate organs. I think because they have the advances now, like those ex vivo machines, there's certain serums in some of those machines that they can rehabilitate the lungs. So they can clean up all that damage and make them viable, whereas like a couple years ago they couldn't. Like even sometimes now they're starting to actually get organs from people who have drowned. They were too afraid to do that before because there was no way to clear out like the water damage and stuff, and they were worried about, illnesses being transmitted that way and stuff like that. But now they can actually dry those lungs out and test them and make sure that they're up to function before they can go in. And that's a good thing, because not only does it keep those organs preserved longer than old methods, but yeah, it gives them more of a chance to test to make sure that, nothing's going to immediately fail. So they've made actually huge leaps in transplants. I mean, that was been the most fascinating thing about my blog, is just looking at some of the advances they've made just in the field of transplantation in the last 5 or 6 years. It's incredible. So,
yeah. Wow, that's wild.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's been a learning curve for me, but it's a very fascinating field to begin with. Even though it is pretty scary, because once you're kind of at the line where you're considered for transplant, you have about 3 years or less left on your existing organs, whichever that is. And they say 3 years average because it really depends on what stage you're at in evaluation. Obviously, the earlier you get evaluated, the better shot that you have, because maybe they'll find something before you get last legs of something. But that's another reason why I was kind of glad that I went through the process as early as I did.
Right. So you didn't wait too long.
Right. Because if I would have started it now, with the pain and some of the stuff that I get on a daily basis, and then my oxygen needs now, it would have been that much tougher. So,
right. Now, with the anti-rejection medications, those are pretty rough on your kidneys as it is, right? So, given that you have a pre-existing kidney problem, how does that factor in?
Well, see, and that was the one concern they had back 5 or 6 years ago when I had that first discussion. They weren't sure if I would qualify because of the shape my kidneys are in. Thankfully, because of the drug I took, they're in good shape. But I still have stage 1 kidney disease, and I still have to be careful. There's still, blood pressure medicines and stuff that I have to take. There's the worst case scenario. If they're too hard, I might be looking at a kidney transplant. I'll cross that bridge when it comes to it, but it's, I'm always one to plan for best and worst case at the same time, so I'm never hopefully blindsided. But to me, since kidney transplants have such a high degree of success, and you have living donors and you have swaps and you have cadaverific kidneys, that seems less daunting to me than a lung transplant. I'm just hoping though that I get a year or two in between before something like that would happen. But we'll see. The other thing that people don't realize is some of these drugs, they'll push your levels out of whack, with your glucose. So there's a certain percentage of transplant patients who weren't diabetic before or may not have been at a risk for diabetes that sometimes do develop diabetes after transplant because of the drugs too.
Right.
So, it's definitely not a cure. It's an extension and it's a treatment, but there are trade-offs you make. And obviously, how well your kidneys function after that really does depend on the levels of drugs and how much you need or how you adjust. And then other women I know too sometimes have a lot of problems with their GI tracts after transplant, their GERD flares up, or it gets so severe that they need a feeding tube because they can't maintain proper nutrition, or they potentially need that gastric surgery. There's the Nissen surgery, they go in and they fix that with your stomach and stuff. So, that's the other thing. The center criteria really varies, and I'm lucky that I'm at the center that I'm at with Penn, because if I was at another center, because of the problems that I have with my kidneys or the problems that even just having GERD, I might not be able to list at other places. So, that's an interesting thing too. And sometimes that also drives people to get second opinions because they might be rejected at one center for a certain thing. It used to be back in the day, if I had my lungs tacked like I did, mechanically glued to my chest wall, that was an automatic exclusion. Like, no, there was no way that transplant would take place. Luckily, that's changed because there was a lot of women, too, who I think back in the day got disqualified from transplants that could have done really well with them, with my disease, simply because they had that intervention done to try to stop their lung collapses. So, it's always important, too, if you get a no at one center to try to get at least one more opinion, even though the testing is hard and it's a lot and, it can be fairly expensive. Sometimes if I got into a really bad bind where they told me I had to wait like 2 years or something, it's possible that since I'd already been evaluated at Penn, then I could go to New York, Columbia, and maybe they would evaluate me and see. And then if they accepted me, then I could list at both places because they're in two different locations. So then that might mean if the list is shorter at one place or the other, I might get a call quicker. But then that would be the potential for me to be, at two different centers instead of one. Not everybody gets that opportunity or wants it. And luckily, I'm not one to be in the position to need it. But I also know that that's a consideration for some people too. But then that's also kind of dependent on, if you can afford to relocate for a time, or if you have friends, or if you have ways. Because most of the time too, if you go active, you have to be within 2 hours of your center. So, your centers have to be within like a 2-hour radius of where you're at.
Right, because at any moment you could get that call.
Right. And some people don't have the option of having two centers in that radius. Yeah. And there are places like services like Angel Flight or Wings of Hope or something that will, fly you certain places, but you also have to be within a certain radius for them to be able to do that. And then that's not, commercial flights. That's like prop planes, which still take, a fair amount of time too.
Right.
So there are sources for people, if they want to do a list to kind of cut back on some of that expense with those types of things. But, it's...
This whole thing sounds very stressful.
It is inherently stressful. I mean, but it's not all bad. I think
the fact that we can take organs out of one body and put them into another, like, that's kind of a miracle.
Well, and I mean, just, it's a joke. People will tell you, oh, you're going to change, as a result of this process. And I never knew what those women meant when they were saying that. But I found out over time because the sicker I've gotten, I've always been in tune with my body, but I do tend to listen a lot more.
Yeah.
And be less stubborn than what I used to. And it used to be easier. I mean, I used to get mad at my lungs if I couldn't exercise or I couldn't do certain things. I would get angry and I would get frustrated. But then I realized too that, the part of this is a disease. Like, my lungs are fighting back the best they can. So, I tend to cut them a lot more slack, and I tend to be a lot easier on them, now than I was before, which I think in the end is probably healthier, because sometimes I would push myself to do things that I shouldn't have been doing. And maybe, that whole disability process sucks and it's hard, and it's very hard to fill out those forms and kind of paint the worst case scenario and air all your dirty laundry of, everything that has dragged you down and why you can't work, or what you struggled to hold on to your job and lived with that you didn't even realize that you were carrying around. But it hasn't been the worst thing in the world for me either to have other interests. I can't do improv anymore as actively as I used to, because the concentrator I have, it's like I can't carry it on my back, so it's harder for me to be active. Mm-hmm. But I have my blog, I have social media where I get plenty of interaction. I can talk to, other people. And so the people in my improv community, if I'm doing puppets, I went to like a puppet workshop a couple weeks ago, and they folded me in and included me. I mean, I didn't even have to ask for any accommodation or make any stint. They just naturally worked with me. So, like that kind of thing, it's nice when it happens natural and organic like that. It still gives you a sense that, there's still things about you that are you. Yeah. And that was something I missed out on for a long time, because I felt like the most important thing was to keep working. And I didn't have energy for any of that other stuff. And so I suffered a lot in my personal relationships and in my hobbies and stuff, because, I wouldn't make time for it, because I would be too exhausted just trying to get through the day.
Yeah, and now I think that's really common.
Yeah, I think at least now, I mean, I thought, oh God, it was going to be so hard being out of work, but I'm finding plenty of things to occupy myself with, and keep engaged and keep sharp. So, I probably have like another year or so. They recommend usually that you don't work that first year or so until, you're, stable enough and out of the woods enough. But now I have, some different ideas and different things. I might want to take things in a new direction after I can go back to work once I get cleared, which is something that might not have come to mind if I hadn't gone through this. So I'm not saying that like I'm happy about it, but there were definite like things good stuff that came out of it, in spite of it being kind of scary and dark and somewhat hard to navigate at times.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, as great as it can be. One question I do have, so like, let's say you get your lungs, everything goes well, that you make it past that first year, so you're like mostly out of the woods. Is it possible for the lamb to like infiltrate those new lungs, or do you not have to worry about that anymore?
It is possible. It's happened in a few cases. It's not that common. Mm-hmm. But that's also one of the drugs that I had to go off, that I took in 2009, isn't approved to treatment for lamb. It also shows that once, you're healed from lung transplant, it's safe to go back on, and that it might actually also potentially ward off rejection. So I might be spared some of that fate by being able to go back on that drug after I'm healed. In which case, I mean, even if it would come back, it would probably come back slower. Right. There was one case that I know of, a girl who got transplanted, and then 2 years later it came back, and it hit hard. But that is an extremely rare case, but yet, that's always in our view, right? Yeah. Because you never know what's going to happen with some of these rare diseases, especially when it's like has a genetic component to it.
There's no playbook for it.
Right. So, yeah. But maybe in another, 6 to 10 years, they're already growing ears as far as like bioprinting and stuff like that. Maybe they'll be far enough along with other organs that, synthetic kidneys and lungs, and who knows. And
it's pretty crazy to think about, like, just how much has changed in such a short time, and then think about, going forward, things will happen even faster.
Right. And then, you wouldn't have to necessarily worry about, all those drugs with that, because you just grow your own. Yeah. So then there wouldn't be the potential for rejection. And man, wouldn't that be a beautiful thing? In fact, there's something really extremely experimental that they've been trying in kidney transplant that I'm really hoping pans out, because it's like, wow. So they take, the organ from the, I think they're doing it with living donors now, along with some of the stem cells. And then they do essentially a double transplant, the stem cells at the same time as the kidney. And that trains the body to not reject the organ. So then you can be on less immunosuppressant drugs and potentially be weaned off, which would be incredible advance.
Yeah.
So, I know sometimes too, the lungs are trickier because, they're not encased like the kidneys. Their viability is shorter because there's so much tie-in with the respiratory and circulatory systems. There's a lot more potential for infections and stuff. So, it is one of the trickier organs to transplant, and that's why they're not quite as far along with it as they are with other organs. But the potential, I mean, just for half of the transplantees to be able to get off of those drugs is amazing to think about. So, they're definitely very encouraging advances and different moves that they're making that are going to be kind of revolutionary for the field as a whole, that even if they don't necessarily apply to the organ right now, that, I'm potentially receiving. I get excited for other people just because I know it's such a, crazy journey to begin with.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one last question. This is the new question that I'm asking everyone. Is the American healthcare system as fundamentally unsustainable and irreparable as I've come to think it is?
God, I'm so torn, because a lot of these problems I saw way before the Affordable Care Act, because I got suckered into one of those health savings account plans, and it was the absolute worst experience ever. But I learned so much from it, but talk about sticker shock for drugs, sticker shock of services, all of that. It's just so hard because I think a lot of this really depends on how they're going to handle the existing bureaucracy of the insurance system.
Yes.
And you're also looking at, if you look at it the way that they set up defense with the subcontracting and some of that, even and I understand what Bernie Sanders is saying when he's saying Medicare for all. I'm not necessarily super opposed to that system, except for
Medicare kind of sucks. It's not great to begin with.
Right. But here's the thing. That also drives a lot of the insurance company decisions. So, part of the whole problem, regardless of who, whether it's Aetna, whether it's an affiliate of Aetna's, whether it's an employer, whatever, the whole problem is the underwriting process. Everybody thought that everything was going to get fixed once they cleared out pre-existing condition. But they find other ways to penalize people with chronic illness. And this is something I did not see until I saw, what goes into an employer plan, how much stress they put employers under for the premiums. Now, in the market that I worked in, it was transparent. So, for the premium, the employers knew exactly what they were getting, blah, 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 blah. But it's not always that way with your garden variety, like Aetna, United plans or whatever. They charge a set premium and that's it. It doesn't matter. And they don't know what percentage of that is actually going to fund the claims or what percentage of that is going to fund the drugs, any of that. They don't get any of that information. It's all just kind of on faith that they're doing the right thing and doing the right thing by people and paying out things, versus an employer working with someone and kind of paying the costs, the claims themselves and the cost of the drugs themselves to a certain percentage and stuff for a certain amount that they charge an employee for that coverage. So, but that's something too, that's a lot of inside baseball that people don't realize. But with this push to these high deductible plans and stuff, it just puts more pressure on the employee or on the person with those plans to pay up first. But it's impossible to price. You look at a house repair or you look at a car repair, there's usually a certain estimate, right? For a front end damage or, a hole in your roof, a ballpark. not for any of these services, because it's all behind the door, closed contract, sealed and delivered, right? Even with like Medicaid to a certain degree, like you don't know how much they're actually charging for like an MRI, like of the wrist even. Let's just do like something stupid, right? So like one facility up the road could charge 400. The hospital could charge 12. Like, is there any difference in the machines? Maybe not, right?
Yep.
But it's all because, that's what they feel like the going rate is. There's no parity and there's no like rate card or estimate card like there is for other services. So that's what makes all of this so hard to understand and so hard to unravel. And especially like with us with oxygen, like that was a huge eye opener of how much like even BS is in like Medicare and Medicaid. Because if you're a younger patient like I am, right, you want something that's like lighter and easier to carry and is going to keep you active for longer. But you also want something that's, if you have a progressive disease, that's going to kind of grow with you and going to have a higher liter flow, the more oxygen you need to start to use. Unfortunately, the machines are not designed that way. And even if you find one that says, will say, use less than half the power of the one that you have, it's not like a splint or a cast where you can just go up the road to a medical supplier and say, I want you to order that for me. If it's not on their approved list of vendors or whatever, or it's not what they're getting for their Medicare or Medicaid patients, like you can't get it.
Right.
Which is totally stupid. Like, so there's, and that's just one example of a piece of equipment, right? And if you would try to do that and go outside the system and buy that outright, it will cost you anywhere from probably $1,850 for a used one to like $4,000 or $5,000 for a completely like new machine. And who has that kind of money?
Right. I mean, especially if you're on Medicaid
right.
or Medicare.
But I always used to wonder, well, why don't you let me just buy this and keep it? But then it made sense as to why they rent. If your oxygen continues to go up, you may need to graduate machines, which ended up happening to me. But it seemed silly and stupid for me, too, to be like, why do I have to pay $150 a month on my deductible to rent this shit from somebody? Like, why can't it just be like a cast or splint or something that I pay a finite cost and they give it to me for the life of it?
Right. It's like renting your cable box.
Right. So, there's a lot of this kind of like behind that universal is not really going to solve, because you're going to get all these dickering from these companies of what the market value of their equipment is or what the value of their service is, and they're never going to come to an agreement, and they're always going to want the highest price. So, I don't know what the answer is. I think it's almost like a combination of socialized or universal for certain services, like, I don't know, hospitalizations, maybe ER visits, stuff like that. But then there's going to have to be a certain amount of flexibility for different things too. It's really complex. I used to think too that just moving to a single payer is going to fix it all. And I don't think that anymore, having worked on the inside, but I definitely see it as a better solution, maybe.
Right.
Because these insurance companies, they're not sharing the wealth.
Right.
When they save money, that is not going back to the company that saved them that money, even a percentage. It's not going to their ground floor people who are taking the calls every day, unraveling these messes to save them money. It's going into executive pockets. So, it's not like, I would be less mad if we knew that, like, okay, a percentage of that, like, they had to cap executive bonuses on that if they had some kind of law, to put a cap on that, or that they passed some kind of law that they had to share a certain percentage of the savings, pass it along to subscribers and to, the employers. Then I would be a little bit more willing to keep things status quo. There's definitely got to be a change because this shit's just gonna run aground.
Right,
But
and it's just been trending upwards for years and
Right.
years and years, like long before the Affordable Care Act. Like that's the reason that we had the Affordable Care Act in the first place. It was already fucked up.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's such a, you know, it's such a complex thing, and that's a kind of stuff too that kind of I ruminate on just because of my experiences over time, both personal and professional. That like I get into it at a level that like most people don't get into it at. But like some of that is just like I don't know. I wish I had a good solution.
Yeah, I think we all do.
But yeah, I mean, obviously though, as much as people bitch Canada and a few of these other countries, yeah, their system isn't perfect. You hear stories about problems, but they still in effect are doing something relatively right, because their service seems to rank a lot higher and cost less than what it's costing us,
right?
So there's got to be a happy medium somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere.
But you have to you have to find some way to like rein in these insurance companies and their power, which in the current climate of Washington is going to be very tough because it's a very hard hobby to bust. But got anyone for trying.
I forget what the name of the book was. I want to say it was America's Bitter Pill. It might have been a different book. But some guy who had wrote a lot about the insurance industry, like for the New York Times, then was going to do a book about it. And then it turned out that he had an aortic aneurysm. And like, so he wound up being in the healthcare system and then getting like one day in the mail, 40 different bills came, or like 40 different pieces of paper. And so he actually already had a meeting set up with the CEO of his health insurance company just to like interview him for the book. So he like brought the papers with him and was like, "Can you make any sense of this?" And the guy was like, "No, none of this makes sense. I don't know." And so I actually didn't wind up finishing the book because it was kind of boring, but I heard interviews with the author, and I heard him say several times that he actually wound up feeling, not entirely, but at least to some extent, it feels like a little bit bad for the insurance companies because, like, while the insurance companies are definitely playing a part in the fuckery that is our healthcare system, like what he found was that it was really like the medical device and pharmaceutical companies that were driving up costs. I don't know if I believe that, but that was like an interesting perspective to hear.
That, there's a little kernel of truth in that.
Yeah.
Especially in transplant world, because you get all of these drugs that are very costly and expensive, and they're on the specialty tiers.
Right.
Which is like the highest copays on most plans. Mm-hmm. But they also like the percentage of what the employer pays on those is actually quite high. And some of these metrics and stuff, like I was a little bit more privy to because of the sector I worked in. Like I could see all the data, and I saw claims processed from day to day. I saw the charges with the discounts where, a lot of this stuff that the average consumer doesn't actually see. Mm-hmm. So there is some truth to that, but on the same token, the majority. And there's people on the inside that are good, but just like there's people on the inside of pharma that are good too and are trying to do good. So I mean, I get his point with that, and to a certain extent, they're human industry, but I can't feel sorry for these executives who also push these mergers to get people less choice and less options. Or, throw a fit and then decide that they don't want to be part of the ACA anymore because their reimbursements are down, because they're having to, like, carry people who are actually sick. Right. God forbid,
Which is the biggest bullshit.
Right. Their executive bonus goes down, $6,000 a year. Like, you make too much already. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm sorry. You're not going to get sympathy from me on that. Especially when you're not sharing those bonuses with the people who are doing the lion's share of the work.
Right.
Okay, as far as like really unraveling messes, making sure that those claims are getting paid, that they're getting examined, the medical examiners, the claims processors, all those people, the frontline agents who are taking all these angry calls, none of them are seeing those bonuses.
Yeah, which is so true of every customer service
Right.
ever.
And I know it's the whole flows downhill philosophy, but
there's your trickle down economics for you.
right. Like, how do you expect people to feel sorry if you're still making hand over fist and everybody else is being bled dry? Like, come on. So, a lot of that, yeah, I can see in part, but I don't wholly agree with either.
Yeah. I'm kind of in the same boat. Well, this was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to In Sickness and in Health. Find resources and more from us at insicknesspod.com and on social media at insicknesspod. And don't forget to be excellent to yourselves and each other.